Our hope is that you've all caught the vision for hope at the end by now, and you're ready to get involved. There's a few practical tips that you need to be aware of, and we'll go through them in just a moment. Our main aim is to ensure that when people are facing the stresses and strains that the end of life can bring, they can, as we've been discussing, hold on to spiritual lifelines and know that there is a deeper hope that goes beyond the here and now. We must face this reality. We need to get real with the reality. Approach it like the Boy Scouts. Be prepared. And that preparation should be practical and, of course, mental, but it also should be spiritual. Here's the thing. The medical experts, with all their life-extending technology, and praise God for medical science, we're so grateful for all of the care and brilliance and insight that we've seen even here today. They're not who we really just want solely in charge. That's what we've been discussing. Medicine should not be in charge of every aspect of the end of life. Deep down, as much as it's easier for each of us to devolve all of the decision making, we actually do want to make the best decisions for ourselves as individuals, for those our most loved ones, and for those we're caring for at the end of their life. Because these are not just choices about physical survival, as we've been discussing. They concern our social well-being, but also our spiritual well-being. When the body isn't fully functioning, when our systems are shutting down, you and I need to understand that this shell, is not everything. It's not all that we are. We all need that reminder. Our whole personhood does not dissolve into our physicality. We're more than just a standard set of symptoms to fix, whether it's fluid in the lungs or inability to swallow. And peace has been found and can be found in the worst medical situations. You and I just need to use our God-given wisdom to make the right choices. And we need tools and materials that will fortify us and make us able to view death as transition, and our life that's gone as a legacy that's littered with love. Littered with love. And this is where Mona's dream for the Hope Initiative began. It's this series of talks that describe the universal values that we all ascribe to, and how we can face them, how we can find them, rather, even as we're facing the great giants, especially the giant of the fear of death. We must realize that doing everything for ourselves and our patients, of our loved ones, in the end means that they must be sure they can get care for the body. Of course, we would all agree with that. But more importantly, for the heart, for the mind, for the spirit of the person. We need to look beyond the tangible things that we know and trust, but know that life is so much more, that there is a bigger horizon. God's promise, do not be afraid. I am with you. It's so critical, so important. We all need support. And in that short sentence, God himself is offering to us that support, the support of his presence, the support of his love. And the fear of death, whether imminent or far off, can only be overcome by our essential values that make life worth living: hope, faith, love, peace, joy. Our systems, our institutions, our culture seem intent on quashing even a conversation about hope at the end. And it's our mission and our privilege to restore and reinstate faith and the hope it brings at the end of life. If we can begin to have conversations as people of faith about what we believe happens after death, we open ourselves up more and more to the great comfort attainable through an understanding that dying is an end. Yes, of course it is, but it's also a beginning. It's a transition. The comfort that appreciation can provide to the person who is dying is immeasurable. But even more than that, it ripples out to the people who care for them, because they recognize that death can be shrouded in hope, not just in fear all the time. And I want to introduce to you a friend of mine. He's a magnificent man who understands the nuances of faith in our culture. He has his own journey as a caregiver. He's an author, a journalist, social commentator. Please would you give it up for Pete Wehner, who's going to come and join us now. Pete, come on. Come and take a seat. Thank you. There we go. I switched it off, and now it's switched on.
Okay.
Are you switched on?
Good.
So, Pete, tell us a little bit about yourself. I was going to read your bio, but then I thought it might get a little bit embarrassing. Tell us. You tell us.
Sure. Thanks. I'm most importantly a husband of my wife Cindy, who's here, and father of 3 children. And I grew up I was born in Dallas, grew up in Washington State, been in the Washington, D.C. area since just after college, came out here on an internship. Been involved in political and public life my entire life. Right now I'm a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, which is a think tank. I am a contributing editor to the New York Times. Person of the Christian faith, didn't grow up as a Christian in our home, but began a journey at the end of high school and in college that has continued. And so that has become kind of the central pillar of my life. It's been a journey that's been filled with wonder and joy, but doubt and uncertainty along the way too. And I've been somebody who's benefited enormously, really from others in that journey.
You write a lot in your journalism, in your books, about faith in the public arena.
Right.
And how do you see that? The reason that I was so keen to have you come today is to really respond to the experts that we just had here. From your perspective, writing as you do, New York Times, Washington Post, how do you see faith in the public arena when you listen to that?
Well, I must say, when I listened to that, I was really moved by it and helped, actually. I thought there was just tremendous practical help. But I think it touched on something that's relevant not just to the world of medicine, but relative to my world and relative to the world at large, which is when, in my case, the Christian faith, when you have people who are able to speak and give witness to the human dimension of life, and to reach people in their heart and in their soul and where they live, and is there in moments of joy, but also sorrow and loss. That's a very, very powerful thing. And people want to hear about that. And I think the question is really to find people who are able to speak to the best of faith rather than the worst. As I said, politics is my world. And I think there are a lot of people who are of the Christian faith who are involved in politics who present the worst rather than the best face of Christianity, who appeal to the darker instincts rather than the better angels. That's not true across the board for sure, but I think it's true enough that it's a problem. I felt that really throughout my life that there is a place for Christians in the public arena, including in the political arena, because I think politics, for all of its downsides, is finally and fundamentally about justice, and I think justice should matter to people of the Christian faith. But I've seen enough and experienced enough to know that there are tremendous temptations in that arena as well, and passions can get stoked, and people can subordinate faith to ideology, political ideology, and that comes at a great cost. So my view as a general matter is that there is a tremendous opportunity for people of faith, but it's not easy. There's treacherous ground, and you have to walk it carefully, and you need the right people to walk it carefully, and that's ultimately finding people, I think, who themselves have been deeply touched by faith, whose affections and hearts have been won over by Christ, and then to have that radiate outward.
The dream is what we're talking about here, a greater conversation about spirituality.
Right.
I come from England, I come from the UK, and it seems that there's actually less and less openness to talk about that It's the opposite is happening.
Right.
I remember a few years ago, the well-known, in England, the well-known Rottweiler of a journalist, Jeremy Paxman, he was interviewing Tony Blair, who'd just come back from DC. And he said to him in a sneering tone, "Did you pray with President Bush?" Like that would have been the worst thing that anyone could ever do. And that's the way things are going in the UK. It's taking even the conversation, the notion of spirituality out of the public arena. Right. Do you perceive that happening here in America, or is it are the defenses good enough to withstand that?
Well, I think the defenses are greater here than in the UK for a lot of complicated reasons, but I do think it is happening. I mean, there's no question, if you look at the survey data, that this country is becoming more secular, and particularly among younger people, there's really a sea change among the people in their 30s and below in terms of institutional affiliations with churches. So something is going on. But, my own view is that that there is a market out there. And when I say there's a market out there, what I mean by that is that there are people who are longing for conversations about life and meaning and death and suffering and doubt and joy. These things have been a part of the human condition since the beginning of time, and they will continue until the end. So I don't think we have to really worry about creating a market. I think that the key is to figure out, how do you reach that market? How do you speak? How do you present your case in a way that people will want to listen? And I think a lot of that has to do with presenting the faith in a way that people see it and say, those folks have something. I'll tell you an anecdote. A very close friend of mine, Pete Wehner, who was really my spiritual mentor from college, and an enormously important figure in my life, really throughout every kind of season of sorrow in my life. And Steve was dying of cancer, and he began to chronicle his journey on the Caring Bridge. That was just really for friends to know. And this had an enormous reach. I don't know, they had like hundreds of thousands of people that would read it. And it was, and the reason it was is because he chronicled his journey with authenticity. He did it, he talked about the anguish and the pain, and he talked about the joy and the hope. And he did it so honestly that it really moved people. So at one point, I took one of his entries and I copied it and I sent it to a friend of mine who is gay, atheist, and Jewish. And I just said I wanted to share this with you and gave him a little bit of background on Steve. And he wrote me back and he said, when I read accounts like this and see manifestations of grace and courage, it makes me wish I wasn't an atheist. So as I say, the market is there. It's just a matter of us being able to find a way to reach that need.
We've talked a lot about faith here today. I'm a church pastor, so I'm a Christian. There'll be people in the room that from different religions. There'll be people in the room that would say, I'm a Christian, I think, kind of, that are sort of struggling with their faith journey. We were talking just a couple of days ago about doubt and the place that's played. How have you handled doubt in your life?
Yeah, it's interesting because I still have doubts, and people who are friends of mine, theologians and pastors, will often receive emails from me underscoring the doubts and underscoring the questions. I'll tell you there are a couple of things that have happened. One is I don't get really that uptight with doubt. I take some comfort from the fact that doubt is, I think, a part of the journey for most of us. Not everybody. I mean, there are people who come to faith and never question it, and that's great, and that's fine. But a lot of people do. And, there are biblical figures, the apostles. There was Thomas, of course, who had doubt and needed to put his hand through the hand of Jesus. Jesus himself, when he said, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? I don't know if that was doubt about the existence of God, but it was obviously that he was struggling with what was going on and what was the purpose of it. And even if you take somebody like C.S. Lewis, Lewis is probably the greatest Christian apologist of the 20th century, and had a tremendous impact in my own journey through Mere Christianity and other books. He wrote a book in 1940 called The Problem of Pain, which was an intellectual look at how do you explain pain. And he said that pain was a megaphone to rouse a deaf world. It was a very clinical, and I think ultimately too neat and tidy, a discussion of pain. In the 1960s, early 1960s, he wrote a book which actually was anonymous at first, called A Grief Observed, and it was a diary in the aftermath of the death of his wife, Joy, who died of cancer. And Lewis's faith buckled. He has a section early on in that book where he says, he talks about what happens when you go to God and you find a door bolted and double bolted from the inside, and then you meet silence. And he said, my fear isn't so much that I'm not going to believe in God, but that I'm going to see God for who he is and say, deceive yourself no more. Now this came from a man who's probably touched more lives in terms of the faith as anybody in the 20th century. And he had doubt. Now he came back to faith, but I think that he understood, having experienced grief, that it's rather more complicated than he thought when he wrote A Problem of Pain. The way I do it is I try and locate those doubts, that is to keep them from being vague and trying to isolate what they are, to pursue them in conversations, to be open about it, to talk to people who have experienced, and to keep that conversation going. And I think the other thing I'd say is, for me, just community has been hugely important. When there are times in my life when God seems distant and dim, I really need other people to help me through the journey. I guess the way I think about it is, sometimes you don't see the sun, but sometimes you need to see the moon, which reflects the sun. And I think other people can be that for us, real ambassadors of faith. And one final word on that. What happened to me for a long time when I had doubt is it was a referendum on the character of God. But at some point, I came to focus in on the cross of Christ. And I did a lot of examination in whether that was real. And I became convinced that it was. And what that did is that insulated the doubts from being a referendum on the character of God. Because what I said is, whatever the answer to those questions are, whether they're macro questions of why is there human suffering, or micro questions about why did this happen to my child, the answer may still be mysterious, but it will be consistent with the character of Christ on the cross. And so at whatever point that is revealed to me, then it will be consistent with the love of God. And as I said, that kind of insulated for me from the questions of being existential.
And this today comes at an extraordinary time for you, because you lost your own dad just last week. Would you mind saying anything about Alfred?
No, thank you. Sure. My dad was in his early 90s, and up until about 8 weeks ago, he was really quite good health-wise, but he just took a downward turn. Well, to tell you, you learn about the seasons of life because Cindy and my kids and I went out to my brother's daughter's wedding, which was out in Seattle, and we celebrated that on a Friday. And then my sister Jackie, who was in touch with the nurses, got a call on Saturday saying that Dad had taken a turn for the worst. At that point, the illness seemed to be a mystery. We were trying to figure out, why has he taken such a downward trajectory. And so my brother and I were scheduled to go out the following week to see my dad. But we decided, with the encouragement of Cindy, to go that next day, Sunday morning. I was not there for the passing of my mom. And it was really one of the great regrets of my life, a source of real sorrow for me. And Cindy knew that, so she said, you really should go. So we went, and we got there, and we met with the doctor who was overseeing his care. And in the course of those conversations, I had a lot of questions. It became clear at that point that he thought that my dad had cancer and that the situation was terminal and that he wasn't going to be around long. So at that moment, my dad had been listening to this, and this conversation went on for about 40 minutes. We knew what to do because my dad did not want to last if there wasn't a chance for recovery. So we knew in an instant that we had shifted to a new phase of this journey. And the doctor was very, very good. And so we said, you really need, if we'd asked the doctor to talk to my dad and just to tell him exactly what's going on. At that point, my dad really couldn't speak, but he could hear, and his mental acuity was fine. He would sort of, he would go in and out, but when he was awake, he was alert and he was completely there. And so the doctor began to talk to him, and then at that point, I spoke to him. And my brother was there. And it was actually, it was a wonderful moment, a series of moments, because we had these conversations which were very important. And part of it was to tell him how much we loved him. Part of it was to tell him that this was the end. We just named it. We said, Dad, you have cancer. You're likely not going to live much longer. And we're going to keep you from pain. But in the course of that conversation, it came to my mind this lovely quote from C.S. Lewis in The Last Battle, where he talks about when the life in this world and the adventures of Narnia end, and that everything up to now has been a cover story and a preface, and that what is to begin is the first chapter of an endless story where every chapter gets better than the one before it. And I told him that, and he heard it, and he received it, and he, late in his life, had become a person of the Christian faith. So I was able to speak to him in a language and in a realm that he understood. And then, that night, my brother and I left the next morning, and then my sisters came in and were with him when he passed away. We had our final farewells. And, it was, everybody has, you have your own stories. They were stories, we expressed our love. We talked about stories from our life and happy moments. And that we would see him again.
Thank you for sharing that. We've got a little video, haven't we? Because you went back and you found his church pastor had done a testimony video of his experience of going on an Alpha course, which is an exploration of the Christian faith.
Exactly.
Let's watch that together now.
In Alpha, Nicky Gumbel pointed it out repeatedly. You can have good health, you can have financial security, you can have everything you want. But in my case, as in so many other cases, there just was something missing. There was an emptiness. And that emptiness vanished when Christ came back to my life.
He looks like such a lovely man.
Yeah, he really was. He really was. There's actually a lovely backstory to that too. I must say that, as I said, when I came to faith, I was a person of doubt, and my sister was very instrumental. She had 5 years older, and she had become a Christian. And she came back from the University of Washington. And my best friend and I were at this point just beginning to have these questions. So I remember writing down on my dad's notepad from work all of these questions about philosophy and faith. And she put me in touch with a fellow named Carl Kopic from Westside Church. And so he started a Bible study with my best friend and me. We went through Romans. I had no background, so it was like kind of head spinning. But Carl was really important in my journey of faith. So then you fast forward decades, and over the years I've talked to my dad about faith. So it was a very open relationship. It was never uptight or tense. But my dad was a supremely rational person. For him, it was just the mind, and he couldn't make his way there, and he would say it. But he ended up taking an Alpha course that Carl had offered to him because Carl had become friends of his. And Carl had maintained that friendship with my dad for years, and my dad wasn't a person of faith. He would just come over and spend time with him. And after taking the Alpha course, my dad became a Christian, and Carl still remembers very vividly when he and my mom accepted Christ. There's a lovely line from William Blake in one of his poems called "The Fearful Symmetry," and I think of this as the joyful symmetry, and to think that a person that when I was in high school was so instrumental in bringing me to faith all these years later was there for my dad. It just shows you the power, of a single human life.
Pete, thank you so much for coming today. Thank you so much for giving us the broader perspective, but also just such a wonderfully personal perspective as well. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, Pete Wehner.
Thanks, Jane.